If you ever feel like you're being followed, don't get into the first car that stops, someone had once told Emily Carter, but at 12:47 a.m., with rain soaking through her coat and her 4-year-old son trembling in her arms, rules stopped mattering and survival took over as she rushed off the curb and yanked open the back door of the first black sedan that slowed beside her, breathless, voice shaking as she said, "Please, just drive." The door sealing shut behind her with a quiet click that felt too final, too deliberate, and for 3 seconds nothing happened except the sound of rain hitting the roof in sharp, relentless taps while streetlights smeared across the tinted windows like something melting, and then her son shifted against her shoulder, small fingers gripping her collar as he whispered, "Mom, this isn't a taxi," and something cold slid down her spine because he was right. There was no meter, no dashboard glow, no faint smell of stale coffee or air freshener, just clean leather and silence that pressed in too tight, and before she could reach for the handle, before she could say anything else, a voice came from the darkness behind her, low and controlled, "Drive," and the car moved instantly, smooth and fast, pulling away from the curb like it had been waiting, like she had stepped into something already in motion, and Emily turned, heart slamming against her ribs, finally seeing him in the reflection of passing light. A man seated in the back with her, not beside her but angled, watching, his presence filling the space without effort, dark suit, sharp lines, eyes that didn't flicker or soften, and outside, headlights surged closer in the rear window, too close, too aggressive, another car pushing through the rain like it had no intention of stopping, and Emily's breath caught as she realized it wasn't random, it wasn't coincidence, they were following her, they had been, and she hadn't even noticed until now. "Stop the car," she said quickly. Voice cracking, trying to reach the handle only to feel it resist under her hand, locked, completely locked, panic rising as she pulled again, harder this time. "Let me out, please, I have my son." "No," the man said, calm, absolute, not loud, not threatening, just certain, and the driver accelerated, the engine deepening as the city blurred past, red lights stretching into streaks, tires cutting through standing water as the car behind them closed in, and Emily clutched her son tighter, instinct taking over as she turned her body to shield him, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep, while the man leaned slightly forward, his gaze shifting past her toward the rear window, calculating, precise, like he was measuring distance, timing, control, and then, without raising his voice, he spoke again, "You were about to be taken," and the words hit her like a second impact, sharp and disorienting, because something in his tone made it sound like a fact, not a guess, not a threat, and before she could process it, before she could decide whether to believe him or fight him, his eyes returned to hers, steady, unreadable, and he added, quieter this time, almost like a decision being made, "Now you're mine," and the car surged forward into the rain-soaked night, leaving everything she understood behind in a single breath. The city lights stretched into long blurred lines as the car cut through the rain, faster now, smoother, like speed was something it understood too well, and Emily's hands would not stop shaking as she tightened her hold around her son, feeling the rapid rhythm of his breathing against her chest, grounding her just enough to keep from unraveling completely while her eyes kept darting between the dark window and the man sitting across from her, trying to read him, trying to understand what kind of person could speak like that in a moment like this, calm, controlled, as if everything unfolding had already been decided long before she stepped into his car. "I do not belong to you," she said finally, her voice quieter now but steady in a way that surprised even her, because fear had not disappeared, it had simply changed shape, turning sharper, more focused, and the man watched her without blinking, as if weighing her words rather than reacting to them, while outside the headlights behind them grew brighter for a second before suddenly veering off, disappearing down another street as if something unseen had redirected them, and Emily noticed it immediately, the absence of that pressure, the sudden quiet that followed, and her breath caught again. "They stopped," she whispered, almost to herself, and the driver did not answer, did not react, but the man's gaze shifted slightly, acknowledging it without explanation. "Of course they did," he said, and something in the way he spoke made it sound inevitable, not lucky, not accidental, and Emily swallowed hard, her mind racing through possibilities she did not want to consider. "Who are you?" she asked, because that question felt safer than the others, safer than asking what he meant or why he had chosen her, and for a moment there was only the sound of rain again, softer now as the car turned onto a quieter road lined with tall dark Trees and houses set far back behind iron gates, the kind of street she had only ever passed through, never belonged to, and when he finally answered, his voice was almost thoughtful, someone who does not make the same mistake twice, and it was not an answer, not really, but it told her enough to understand that names did not matter to him the way they did to everyone else, that identity was something he controlled, not something he offered, and Emily shifted slightly, adjusting her son so. His head rested more comfortably against her shoulder, her movements careful, deliberate, refusing to show weakness even though every instinct inside her screamed to get out, to run, to put distance between them and this man who spoke in calm sentences that felt heavier than threats. "You said they were going to take me," she said, forcing the words out because she needed something real, something concrete to hold on to. And this time he did not look away, did not deflect, his eyes meeting hers. Directly with a clarity that made her chest tighten. "They were not after you," he said, and the sentence landed strangely, like a puzzle missing a piece. "Then why were they following me?" she asked quickly, and he leaned back slightly, one hand resting against the edge of the seat, composed, unhurried, as if time itself bent differently around him. "Because you were in the wrong place at the wrong time," he replied, and Emily felt something twist inside her at those words, something colder. Then fear, because that was how all of this had started, a wrong turn, a wrong street, a wrong car, and now nothing felt accidental anymore, and now, he continued, his voice lowering just enough to make her listen more closely, "you are in the right place," and Emily shook her head. Immediately, instinctively rejecting that idea, because nothing about this felt right, nothing about being locked in a car with a stranger who controlled everything around her could ever be right, but before she could argue, before she could push back again, the car slowed, tires crunching softly against gravel as a large gate ahead of them began to open without anyone touching it, revealing a long driveway lit by soft golden lights leading toward a house that looked less like a home and more like something protected, something hidden, and Emily's heart dropped as realization settled in, not sudden, not dramatic, just quiet and heavy, because wherever this was, it was not a place people simply left, and the man's voice came again, steady, certain, as if confirming the thought she had not said out loud. "You needed protection," he said, pausing just long enough for the weight of it to sink in, "and now you have it." And Emily stared at the open gates as the car moved forward, knowing. Without knowing how that whatever line she had crossed tonight, she could not step back over it anymore. The car rolled to a smooth stop beneath a covered entrance, the engine quieting as if even the machine understood it had arrived somewhere important, somewhere controlled, and Emily did not move at first, her fingers still gripping her son as she stared through the rain-streaked window at the towering structure ahead, lights glowing warm against stone walls that felt too solid, too permanent, like they had been standing long before her life had ever unraveled into this moment, and for a second. She considered refusing to step out, considered staying exactly where she was until someone forced her, but the door unlocked with a soft click that broke the silence again, and the driver stepped out without a word, opening her side as cool air slipped inside, carrying the faint scent of wet pavement and something cleaner, sharper, and Emily hesitated, her instincts pulling in two directions at once, run or stay, fight or protect, and in the end her son shifted slightly in her arms, his small voice barely audible as he murmured, "Mom, I am cold," and that decided it, because whatever fears she felt, his comfort came first, always, so she stepped out carefully, her shoes touching smooth stone as she pulled her coat tighter around both of them, her eyes lifting immediately to the man who had followed her out, now fully visible beneath the soft light, his presence even more defined outside the car, taller than she had realized, composed in a way that made everything around him feel arranged, intentional, and he watched her not like a stranger, not like someone curious, but like someone assessing a situation he had already taken responsibility for. "Inside," he said, not harsh, not demanding, just certain, and Emily did not respond right away, her gaze flicking past him to the edges of the property, noticing the subtle movement of figures she had not seen before, men positioned at a distance, still but aware, like part of the environment itself, and that realization settled heavily in her chest because this was not just a house, it was a place that expected danger, prepared for it. And that meant whatever he had said earlier was not exaggeration. "This is not my home," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. But he heard it anyway, of course he did, and his expression did not change as he replied, "Not yet," and the words lingered in the air between them, ambiguous, unsettling, and Emily swallowed, shifting her son again as she took a step forward, crossing the threshold into a space that immediately felt too quiet, too controlled, the kind of silence that came from structure rather than absence, and inside, the warmth wrapped around her almost instantly, soft lighting reflecting off polished floors, everything clean, ordered, untouched by the chaos she had just escaped, and for a brief moment her body reacted before her mind could catch up, muscles loosening slightly, breath slowing just enough to remind her how exhausted she truly was, but that feeling disappeared as quickly as it came when she remembered where she was, who had brought her here, and why none of this made sense. "I need to leave," she said, turning slightly as if testing whether the door behind her was still an option, but she did not move toward it, not yet, because something told her it would not be that simple, and he stepped closer then, not invading, not forcing, but closing the distance just enough that she could feel the shift in the air, his voice lower now, steady. "You can leave," he said, and for a second hope sparked, sharp and immediate, but it faded just as quickly when he added, "But not tonight," and Emily's chest tightened at that, the reality of it settling in fully for the first time, that this was not a temporary stop, not a misunderstanding that would resolve itself, and she looked at him again, really looked this time, searching for something human, something she could reach. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. Because that question mattered more than anything else, more than where she was or how she would leave, and for the first time since she had met him, there was the faintest pause, the smallest hesitation, as if the answer was not something he offered often, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, but no less certain. "Because someone made a mistake," he said, his gaze holding hers, unwavering, "and I do not let mistakes become consequences," and Emily felt those words settle deep, heavier than anything he had said before, because they carried meaning she did not yet understand, and as her son stirred again, his small hand clutching her sleeve, she realized with a quiet, unsettling clarity that whatever had started tonight was far from over, and that the man standing in front of her was not just part of the danger she had escaped, but something far more complicated, something she had not yet learned how to survive. Emily did not realize how tired she was until the silence settled around her, not the empty kind she was used to in her small apartment, but a controlled silence that felt deliberate, like even the walls here were listening, and she stood there for a moment longer than necessary, her son growing heavier in her arms as his breathing deepened into sleep, his small face pressed against her shoulder as if none of this had happened, as if children could choose what to remember and what to forget. And she envied that more than anything in that moment, the ability to simply rest without questions, without fear, while her own mind refused to slow down, replaying every second from the street to the car to this place that did not belong to her, and she finally shifted her weight, adjusting him carefully as she looked around again, taking in the details she had missed at first, the clean lines, the absence of clutter, the way everything had a place and nothing was out of order, and it made her feel even more out of place, like she had stepped into someone else's life by accident and could not find the exit. "He needs somewhere to sleep," she said quietly, breaking the stillness because focusing on him was easier than thinking about anything else, and the man nodded once, already turning as if he had expected that, as if her next move had been obvious to him from the beginning. "Follow me," he said, and Emily hesitated only for a second before moving after him, her steps slow, cautious, every instinct still alert even as exhaustion pulled at her, and the hallway stretched longer than she expected, soft light lining the walls, footsteps muted against the floor, and she noticed how he walked, not fast, not slow, but with certainty, never looking back to check if she was following because he already knew she would. And that unsettled her more than anything else, that quiet confidence, that assumption of control, and when he stopped in front of a door and opened it, stepping aside just enough to let her enter first, she paused again, scanning the room before crossing the threshold, because trust was not something she could offer, not yet, and inside, the space was simple but complete, a bed, soft blankets, a small lamp casting a warm glow, nothing excessive, nothing threatening, just enough to feel safe without being overwhelming, and that confused her even more, because this did not match the image she had built in her mind of him, of this place, and she stepped in slowly, lowering her son onto the bed with careful hands, watching as he curled instinctively into the warmth, his face relaxing completely for the first time that night, and something inside her softened at that, just slightly, just enough to remind her that not everything was broken yet, and she pulled the blanket over him, tucking it around his shoulders before stepping back, her eyes lingering on him a moment longer than necessary, grounding herself again before turning toward the door where he still stood, watching, always watching, and she straightened slightly, her voice quieter now but firm. "Thank you," she said, because whatever this was, whatever he had done, he had given her son a place to rest, and that mattered, even if nothing else made sense, and for a brief second something shifted in his expression, not enough to fully change it, but enough to suggest that he had not expected those words, not from her, not now, and he inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement, as if accepting something unspoken, before stepping aside completely, giving her space without saying it out loud, and Emily remained where she was, not moving toward the door, not stepping further into the room, caught somewhere in between leaving and staying, and she realized then that this was the first real choice she had been given since the night began, small as it was, uncertain as it felt, and she did not know what frightened her more, the idea of staying here under his control, or the possibility of walking out into a world that had already proven it was not safe for her, and when she finally spoke again, her voice carried that uncertainty despite her effort to hide it. "What happens in the morning?" she asked, because that question felt bigger than anything else, bigger than the night, bigger than the fear, and he did not answer immediately, his gaze steady as if considering not just the question but what she was ready to hear, and when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, but there was something else beneath it now, something that felt almost like inevitability. "In the morning," he said slowly, "you will understand why you cannot go back." And Emily felt those words settle deep, heavier than she expected. Because they did not sound like a warning, they sounded like truth, and as she looked back at her son, sleeping peacefully in a place that was not theirs, she realized that whatever morning brought, it was not going to give her the life she had before, and somewhere in the quiet of that room, that reality began to take shape. Emily did not sleep, not really, even after the door closed and the quiet of the room settled fully around her, because rest required trust and she had none left to give, so she stayed seated at the edge of the bed, watching her son breathe, counting each rise and fall of his chest like it was the only thing keeping her anchored in reality, while her mind circled the same questions over and over: who he was, what he wanted, why she had been followed, and why the answer he gave felt incomplete, like she was only seeing the edge of something much larger. And at some point the rain softened outside, fading into a distant whisper against the windows, and the silence grew deeper, heavier, until the first hint of pale light began to filter through the curtains, signaling a morning she had not asked for but could not avoid, and Emily exhaled slowly, her body stiff from hours of stillness as she carefully stood, adjusting the blanket around her son one more time before moving toward the window, her steps quiet, controlled, as if making noise would somehow break whatever fragile balance she was standing on, and when she pulled the curtain aside just slightly, the view beyond confirmed what she already suspected. This place was not just isolated, it was protected, wide ground stretching out with deliberate spacing, cameras positioned in places that were easy to miss unless you were looking for them, and movement in the distance that told her the presence she had felt last night had not disappeared, it had simply shifted into daylight, more visible now, more real, and her chest tightened at the realization that leaving would not be as simple as walking out the front door, not because she was being held, but because the world outside those gates might not be safer than what was inside them, and that thought unsettled her more than anything else, because it meant her choices were not clear anymore, not right or wrong, but something in between, and she let the curtain fall back into place, turning just as the door opened without a knock, her body tensing instantly before she even saw who it was, and he stepped inside with the same controlled presence, unchanged by the daylight, as if time moved differently for him, as if night and morning were simply different settings of the same world he already owned. And his gaze moved first to the bed, confirming the child was still asleep, before returning to her, assessing, noting the details she had not realized she was revealing, the exhaustion, the alertness, the refusal to break, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching again, but this time it felt different, less uncertain, more like a pause before something inevitable, and Emily broke it first, because she needed answers more than she needed comfort. "You said I would understand," she said, her voice steady despite the tension in her chest, "so explain it," and he studied her for a second longer, as if deciding how much truth she could handle, or how much he was willing to give, and then he moved slightly closer, not enough to intimidate, just enough to close the distance between question and answer. "The car last night was not looking for you," he said, repeating the point with more clarity now. And Emily's brow tightened, frustration surfacing because she already knew that part. "Then why me?" she pressed, because that was the part that mattered, and his gaze did not shift, did not soften. "Because you were seen," he replied, and the simplicity of that answer made it more unsettling, not less. "Seen where?" she asked quickly, and he paused again, but this time it was shorter, more deliberate. "At a place you should not have been," he said. And something clicked in her mind, something small but sharp, a memory she had dismissed at the time, a turn she had taken, a moment she had not thought twice about, and her stomach tightened as realization began to form, not complete, not clear, but enough to feel dangerous, and she shook her head slightly, more to herself than to him. "I did not do anything," she said, because that felt important, because innocence should mean something, but his expression did not change, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that settled heavily in the room. "It does not matter what you did," he said quietly, "it matters what they think you know," and Emily felt the air leave her lungs at that, because that was not something she could fix, not something she could explain away, and for the first time since the night began, the situation shifted in her mind, not from confusion to clarity, but from denial to understanding. That this was not a mistake that could be corrected, it was a situation that had already taken shape around her, and she looked at him again, really looked this time, not just at the danger he represented, but at the control he held, the certainty in his voice, the way he spoke as if outcomes were something he managed, and her voice dropped slightly as she asked the only question left that mattered, "So what happens now?" And he did not hesitate this time, not even for a second, his answer immediate, certain, leaving no space for doubt. "Now," he said, his gaze steady, unyielding, "you stay where they cannot reach you," and Emily's heart tightened at that, because she understood what he was not saying, that staying here meant staying with him, under his rules, in his world. And as the weight of that settled over her, she realized that whatever path lay ahead, it was no longer hers to choose alone. Emily did not respond immediately, not because she did not understand what he was saying, but because she understood it too well, and that made it harder to accept, because staying meant giving up control, and control was the only thing she had left, even if it was fragile, even if it was already slipping through her fingers, and she crossed her arms instinctively. A small protective gesture that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with holding herself together. "You are asking me to trust you," she said quietly, her voice steady but edged with something sharper now, something that had been building since the moment she stepped into that car, and he did not deny it, did not soften it, his gaze holding hers with the same calm certainty. "No," he said, and the simplicity of that answer caught her off guard. "I am telling you that you do not have another option," and the words settled heavily between them, not cruel, not harsh, just honest in a way that left no room for illusion, and Emily felt her jaw tighten at that, her instinct pushing back immediately, because she had spent too long surviving on her own to accept that her choices were gone. "There is always another option," she replied, her voice low but firm, and for a moment something almost imperceptible shifted in his expression, not disagreement, not anger, but something closer to acknowledgement, as if he respected the resistance even if he did not agree with it, and he stepped back slightly, giving her space without retreating entirely. "Then you should consider them carefully," he said, and there was something in his tone now that felt less like a command and more like a test, and Emily exhaled slowly, her mind racing through possibilities that felt increasingly limited the longer she considered them. Leave and risk being seen again, stay and risk losing herself in a world she did not understand, and neither option felt like safety, not really, and before she could respond again, a small movement behind her pulled her attention instantly, her son shifting in his sleep, a soft sound escaping him as he turned slightly under the blanket, and everything else faded for a moment as she moved back toward the bed, instinct overriding everything else as she adjusted the blanket around him, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead, her touch gentle, grounding, and when she straightened again, something inside her had settled, not completely, not permanently, but enough to shift her focus, because this was not just about her anymore, it never had been, and she turned back toward him, her gaze clearer now, more focused. "If I stay," she said, choosing her words carefully, because this was the first real decision she was Making since the night began, it is for him, and she nodded slightly toward the bed, making it clear where her priority lay, and his eyes followed her gesture briefly before returning to her, and for the first time there was no calculation there, no assessment, just a quiet understanding of what she was saying, and he inclined his head once, accepting that without question. Of course, he said. And the certainty in his voice made it clear that he had expected nothing less, and that unsettled her again, the way he seemed to already know her decisions before she made them, as if he understood the patterns of people better than they understood themselves, and she swallowed, pushing that thought aside as she focused on what mattered next. Then I need to know what happens while we are here, she continued, because staying did not mean surrendering completely, not yet, and he did not hesitate this time. You rest, he said, his tone steady, practical. You remain inside the main house. And you do not leave the grounds without me. And Emily's brow furrowed slightly at that, the last part settling heavily. Without you, she repeated, and he nodded once, not apologizing for it, not explaining it further, because to him it did not require explanation, and that was the part she struggled with the most, the way his world operated on rules. That did not need justification, only acceptance, and she looked at him for a long moment, weighing everything she knew against everything she did not, and finally she gave a small nod, not agreement, not fully, but acknowledgement, because for now it was enough, and as she did, he turned slightly toward the door, as if the conversation had reached its natural end, but before he stepped out, he paused, just briefly, and without looking back, he added, "You are safe here," and the words were quiet, almost understated, but they carried a weight that lingered after he left, settling into the space he had occupied, and Emily stood there for a moment longer, listening to the silence return, different now, less uncertain but no less heavy, and as she looked back at her son, sleeping peacefully in a place that was not theirs, she realized that safety and freedom were no longer the same thing, and she did not know yet which one she was willing to give up. The silence after he left did not feel empty, it felt structured, like the house itself had rules she could not see yet but was already expected to follow, and Emily remained still for a long moment, listening to the faint echo of his footsteps disappear down the hallway before she allowed herself to exhale fully, the tension in her shoulders loosening just slightly as she turned back toward the bed, grounding herself again in the only thing that made sense, her son sleeping peacefully, unaware of the invisible lines that had already been drawn around them, and she sat beside him, brushing her fingers lightly over his hair, steadying herself before standing again because staying in one place too long made her thoughts spiral, and she needed to understand this environment, not just survive in it, so she moved toward the door slowly, opening it just enough to step into the hallway, her senses sharpening instantly as she took in the quiet stretch of space beyond, the soft lighting, the distant movement of someone passing at the far end without acknowledging her, not ignoring her but not approaching either, as if her presence had already been accounted for, and that unsettled her in a different way, not threatening, but controlled, like she had been placed into a system that adjusted around her without asking for permission, and she walked a few steps forward, her movements cautious but deliberate, observing everything, the subtle cameras placed high in corners, the doors that remained closed, the quiet efficiency of the few people she glimpsed in passing, each one moving with purpose, never lingering, never questioning, and it became clear quickly that this place did not operate like a home, it operated like something structured. Something designed to function smoothly without interruption, and Emily paused near a large window that overlooked the ground she had only briefly seen before, her gaze scanning the distance as she tried to map it in her mind, the long driveway, the gates, the positions where guards stood at intervals that felt calculated rather than random, and she realized then that leaving was not just physically difficult, it was strategically unlikely, not impossible, but not simple either, and that thought settled quietly. Not as panic but as understanding, because panic would not help her here, only awareness would, and as she stood there, processing everything, she heard footsteps approach from behind, steady, measured, and she turned instinctively, her body tensing before she even saw him, and when he came into view, nothing about him had changed, not his posture, not his expression, as if the entire house reflected his presence, controlled, precise, unshaken by anything around it. And he stopped a few feet away, his gaze taking in the fact that she had left the room, noting it without judgment. "You are exploring," he said, not a question, simply an observation, and Emily held his gaze, refusing to step back, refusing to appear smaller than she felt. "I needed to understand where I am," she replied, her voice calm but edged with quiet defiance, and something almost unreadable passed through his expression, not disapproval, not approval, but recognition, as if he had expected nothing less. And he nodded slightly, acknowledging her reasoning without challenging it. "Then you should know this is not a place people enter by accident," he said, his tone steady, and Emily let out a soft breath, glancing briefly toward the window before looking back at him. "Neither did I," she replied, and for a moment the air between them shifted, not tense, but charged with something unspoken, an understanding that neither of them had planned this, yet both were now part of it, and he stepped closer to the window, his gaze moving beyond her to the grounds below. "Everything you see here exists for a reason," he continued, his voice quieter now, almost reflective. "Every detail, every position, every person," and Emily followed his line of sight, seeing it differently now, not just as a place, but as a system, one he had built or controlled, one that functioned exactly as intended, and that realization made her chest tighten slightly, because it meant she was now inside something far larger than herself, something that did not bend easily, and she crossed her arms again, not defensive this time but thoughtful. "And where do I fit into that?" she asked, because that question had been forming since the moment she stepped out of the car, and he turned his head slightly, his gaze settling on her with a clarity that felt deliberate, measured. "That depends on how you choose to stay," he said, and Emily felt that answer settle deeper than she expected, because it implied something she had not fully considered yet, that staying was not passive, it was a role, a position, something that could shift depending on her actions, and for the first time since the night began, a different kind of thought surfaced, not fear, not resistance, but strategy, quiet and cautious, because if she was going to remain here, even temporarily, she needed to understand the rules, not just follow them, and as she held his gaze, something in her expression changed, not softer, not weaker, but more focused, more aware, and he seemed to notice it immediately, the slight shift in her posture, the way her eyes no longer searched for escape but for understanding, and he gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, as if acknowledging that change without naming it, and then he turned slightly, stepping away from the window. "Come," he said, his voice steady as before, "there are things you need to see," and Emily hesitated for only a second before following, because whatever this place was, whatever he was, she knew one thing with certainty now: standing still would not help her, but learning might. Emily followed him without asking where they were going, her steps measured, her mind alert in a different way now, no longer searching for exits but for patterns, for meaning, for anything that could give her an advantage in a place that clearly operated on rules she did not yet understand. And the hallway shifted as they moved deeper into the house, wider now, brighter, the design opening up into spaces that felt less private and more intentional, as if this part of the house was meant to be seen, and he walked ahead of her with the same quiet certainty, never checking if she was still behind him because he already knew she would be, and that realization no longer unsettled her the way it had before. Instead it sharpened something inside her, a need to keep up, to observe faster, to understand quicker, and when they reached a set of large doors that opened automatically as they approached, she slowed slightly, taking in the room beyond before stepping inside, because this space felt different from the others, not a living area, not a bedroom, but something functional, something that revealed more than it hid, and as she entered, her eyes moved immediately across the details. The large screens along one wall displaying live feeds of different areas of the property, the subtle movement of people coordinating without speaking, the quiet hum of systems running beneath the surface, and for a moment she simply stood there, absorbing it, because this was no longer just a house, it was a center of control, a place where decisions were made and executed without hesitation, and she felt the weight of that settle into her chest as she turned slightly toward him, her voice quieter now but sharper, more focused. "This is not just protection," she said. Because the truth was becoming clearer with every step she took, and he did not deny it, did not deflect, his gaze steady as he watched her take it in. "No," he replied, his voice calm, "it is control," and the word lingered between them, not hidden, not softened, just stated as fact, and Emily exhaled slowly, her arms crossing again as she processed that, because control meant influence, and influence meant reach, and reach meant that whatever danger she had stepped into was larger than she had imagined, and she glanced back at the screens, watching as one of them shifted to a view of the street she had been on the night before, the same rain, the same empty stretch of road, and her breath caught slightly as she recognized it, the memory still too fresh, too close, and he noticed that. Immediately, of course he did, stepping closer just enough that his presence grounded the moment without overwhelming it. "You were here," he said, not asking, just confirming, and she nodded once, her eyes still on the screen. "Yes," she replied quietly, and for a second the room felt smaller, more focused, as if everything had narrowed down to that one point in time, that one decision that had changed everything. And he studied the footage for a moment before continuing. "And you did not notice the car behind you," he added, and it was not an accusation, just an observation, but it still made something tighten in her chest, because he was right, she had not noticed, she had been too focused on getting home, on getting her son out of the rain, on surviving her own life to see the larger danger forming around her, and she shook her head slightly, more to herself than to him. "No," she admitted. And there was no judgment in his response, only clarity. "Most people do not," he said. And Emily turned to look at him again, her gaze searching, because there was something in the way he spoke, something that suggested experience, knowledge that went beyond this moment, and she realized then that he had seen situations like this before, that he understood how easily people could be pulled into something they did not see coming, and that made her next question unavoidable. "So you knew," she said, her voice steady but edged with something sharper now, "you knew they were going to be there," and for the first time since they had entered the room, there was a pause, small but noticeable, and he did not answer immediately, his gaze shifting briefly to the screens before returning to her, and when he spoke, his voice was just as calm as before, but the meaning behind it had shifted. "I knew something was moving," he said, choosing his words carefully. "I did not know it would be you." And Emily felt that settle into her chest, heavier than she expected, because it meant she had not been the target, not originally, she had been the variable, the unexpected element that had changed the outcome, and that realization made everything feel even more unstable, because it meant this situation was still unfolding, still adapting, and she looked back at the screen one more time, the image of the empty street frozen in place, and for the first time since the night began, a different kind of understanding took hold, not just that she was in danger, but that she had stepped into a system that reacted to unpredictability, that adjusted, that moved around variables, and she turned back to him slowly, her voice quieter now but more certain. "Then they are still looking," she said. And he held her gaze without hesitation, his answer immediate, unwavering, "Yes." And the simplicity of that response made it more real, not less, and Emily felt something settle inside her, not fear, not panic, but resolve, because if they were still looking, then standing still was not enough, understanding was not enough, she needed to be part of the solution, not just the problem, and as that thought formed, something in her expression changed again, sharper now, more intentional, and he noticed it instantly. The shift from reaction to decision, and for the first time, there was the faintest hint of approval in his gaze, subtle but unmistakable, as if he had been waiting to see if she would reach this point on her own, and he gave a slight nod before speaking again. "Good," he said quietly, "now you are starting to see it." Emily held his gaze for a second longer, letting that single word settle between them, because it changed everything, not just the situation but her role inside it, and she felt it shift inside her, subtle but undeniable, the moment when fear stopped being enough and understanding became necessary, and she turned back to the screens, studying them with a different focus now, not as someone trapped but as someone trying to read a system that had already begun to move around her, her eyes tracing patterns in the camera feeds, the timing of movement, the way people positioned themselves without hesitation, and she noticed something then, something small but deliberate, a camera angle shifting slightly, adjusting its focus toward a section of the outer perimeter, and she leaned forward just a fraction, her attention narrowing as she watched the feed more closely. "That one," she said quietly, pointing toward the screen, and he followed her line of sight without question, his gaze sharpening almost instantly, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the room itself seeming to pause as the image held steady, and then the movement became clearer, not obvious, not dramatic, but intentional, something out of place in a system that otherwise operated with precision, and Emily felt a small, cold realization settle in her chest, because even without understanding all of it, she could see the difference now, the disruption in the pattern, and she exhaled slowly, her voice lower as she spoke again. "They are testing it," she said, not entirely certain but close enough to feel it, and this time when he looked at her, there was no pause, no hesitation, only confirmation. "Yes," he replied, and the simplicity of that answer made her pulse quicken, not with panic but with clarity, because it meant this was not over, not contained, it was still unfolding, still adapting, just like he had said, and she straightened slightly, her arms dropping to her sides as her focus sharpened further. "Then they know I am here," she said, and he did not correct her, did not soften it, his silence enough to confirm what she already understood, and Emily pressed her lips together for a moment, thinking, because this was the part that mattered now, not what had happened, but what came next, and she glanced at him again, searching for something she had not seen before, not just control, not just certainty, but intention, and she found it, steady and unwavering, as if he had already calculated the outcome and was simply waiting for everything else to catch up, and that realization steadied her in a way she did not expect, because if he was this certain, then there was structure here, not chaos, and she could work with structure, she could learn it, adapt to it, and she took a slow breath before speaking again, her voice more deliberate now. "So what do they want?" she asked, because understanding the threat meant understanding its purpose, and he did not look at the screens this time, his gaze remaining on her, as if the answer was tied more to her than to anything outside. "They want confirmation," he said, and Emily's brow tightened slightly. "Of what?" she pressed, and he stepped closer, just enough to make the space between them feel intentional, controlled. "Of whether you are a mistake," he said quietly, and the words landed with a weight that made her chest tighten, because she understood immediately what he meant, that her presence here was not just an accident, it was a variable, something that needed to be evaluated, defined, and either dismissed or pursued, and she swallowed, her mind racing through what that meant for her son, for everything that had already changed, and she shook her head slightly, more to clear the thought than to deny it. "I did not choose any of this," she said, her voice lower now, not defensive, just stating a truth that felt important to hold on to, and for a moment something shifted in his expression again, not disagreement, not indifference, but recognition, as if he understood that distinction even if it did not change the outcome, and he inclined his head slightly, acknowledging it without argument. "No," he said, "but you are in it now," and Emily felt that settle into place, not as a shock, not anymore, but as a reality she could not step away from, and she turned back to the screen, watching as the subtle movement at the perimeter disappeared again, blending back into stillness as if it had never been there, and that unsettled her more than if it had remained visible, because it meant whoever was out there understood how to move within the system without triggering it fully, and that meant they were not guessing, they were observing, learning, just like she was, and she exhaled slowly, her voice quieter now but more certain. "Then we cannot wait for them to decide," she said, and when she turned back to him, her gaze held a new kind of clarity, not just awareness but intent, and for the first time, he did not simply observe it, he responded to it, a slight shift in his posture, a subtle narrowing of his focus, as if something had just aligned, and he gave a small nod, deliberate, acknowledging the shift she had made. "No," he agreed, his voice steady, "we do not wait." And the way he said it made it clear that whatever came next, it would not be passive, and Emily felt a quiet, steady resolve settle into her chest, because for the first time since the night began, she was no longer just reacting to what was happening around her, she was part of what would happen next. Emily did not look away this time, because something had shifted and she could feel it clearly now, the moment where observation turned into action, and the room around them seemed to respond to it, subtle but immediate, as if the system itself recognized the change in pace, and she glanced once more at the screen where the movement had disappeared, the still image now almost too quiet, too controlled, and that was when she understood the next piece, not from him, but from the pattern itself. "They are not trying to get in," she said slowly, her voice measured as she followed the thought to its conclusion. "They are waiting for us to react," and he did not answer right away, but the slight shift in his posture was enough, the way his attention narrowed just slightly, confirming that she had seen something real, something important, and Emily exhaled quietly, her mind already moving ahead, because if they were being watched, then every move mattered, every decision would be part of the message they were sending back, and she turned toward him fully, her focus sharp now, "So what do we show them?" she asked, because that was the real question, not what they would do, but what they would reveal, and he stepped closer to the central console, his hand resting lightly against the edge as he considered her for a moment, not testing her anymore, not measuring her limits, but including her in the calculation. And that alone changed the dynamic between them in a way she could feel. "We show them certainty," he said, his voice calm, precise, and Emily's brow tightened slightly, because certainty was not something she felt, not yet, but she understood the strategy behind it. Uncertainty invited pressure, hesitation created openings, and whoever was out there would be looking for exactly that, and she nodded slowly, absorbing it. "Then we do not move them," she said, thinking it through aloud. "We move first," and this time there was no pause, no silence, just a quiet agreement in his expression as he inclined his head once. "Yes," he said, and the simplicity of that confirmation sent a subtle shift through the room, the people at the consoles adjusting without being told, the screens flickering with new angles, new data, and Emily felt it, the system coming alive in response to a decision that had just been made, and she watched as one of the screens zoomed out slightly, expanding the perimeter view, not to react to the presence outside, but to redefine the boundaries entirely, and something about that steadied her, the control, the structure, the absence of panic, and she realized then that this was how he operated, not reacting, not chasing, but setting the terms before anyone else could, and she turned back to him, her voice quieter now but more grounded. "And where does that leave me?" she asked, because even with everything she was beginning to understand, that part was still unclear, her place in this, her role beyond simply being protected, and for a moment he studied her again, but this time it was different, not assessing whether she belonged, but deciding how she would be positioned within what was coming next, and when he spoke, his tone carried that same certainty, but there was something else beneath it now, something more deliberate. "It leaves you where they cannot define you," he said, and Emily felt that settle in her chest, because it meant she was not just being hidden, she was being removed from their understanding entirely, made unpredictable, and that made her valuable in a way she had not considered before, and she crossed her arms slowly, not defensive, but thoughtful, because if she was unpredictable, then she could influence what came next, not just endure it, and that realization shifted something deeper inside her, something that had been building since the moment she stepped into the car, and she lifted her chin slightly, her gaze steady as she met his again. "Then do not hide me," she said, the words coming out more confidently than she expected, and for the first time since the night began, there was a visible reaction, not shock, not refusal, but a brief, sharp stillness, as if the possibility had not been dismissed but had not been expected either, and he did not respond immediately, his eyes holding hers as he considered it, not rejecting the idea, but recalculating around it, and Emily did not look away, did not soften her stance, because this was the first time she had stepped forward instead of being pulled along, and the silence stretched for a moment before he finally spoke, his voice lower now, more measured than before. "That depends on whether you understand what that means," he said, and Emily held his gaze without hesitation, because for the first time, she was not asking to be protected, she was choosing to be involved, and whatever came next, she knew one thing clearly now, she was no longer just the mistake in someone else's plan, she was becoming part of it. Emily did not look away, not this time, because something in his question demanded more than instinct, it demanded clarity, and she felt the weight of that settle into her chest as she held his gaze, steady, unflinching, even though part of her still did not fully understand what she was stepping into. "I understand enough," she said quietly, and her voice did not shake, not because she was not afraid, but because she had already crossed too many lines to step back now, and he studied her for a long moment, longer than before, as if measuring not her words but the space behind them, the intent, the resolve, and the silence stretched just enough to make the room feel smaller, more focused, until he finally moved, not away, but closer to the central console, his attention shifting to the screens again as if her answer had already been accepted, already accounted for. "Then you do not stay invisible," he said, his voice calm, decisive, and the words settled between them with a different kind of weight, not restriction, but direction, and Emily felt it immediately, the shift from being protected to being positioned, and her eyes followed his to the screens, watching as the system adjusted again, new feeds coming into focus, angles she had not seen before, expanding the view beyond the perimeter into surrounding streets, surrounding movement, and it struck her then just how far this reach extended, how little of it she had seen at first, and how much of it she would need to understand if she was going to stand where she had just chosen to stand, and she crossed her arms slowly, not out of defense but concentration, her voice lower now as she spoke. "You are going to let them see me," she said, not asking, just confirming, and he nodded once, his gaze still on the screens. "Yes," he replied, "but not as they expect," and Emily exhaled quietly, her mind already moving ahead of the answer. Because that was the key, expectation. If they were watching, then they were building assumptions, and breaking those assumptions meant shifting the balance, and she leaned slightly closer to one of the screens, her focus narrowing as she studied the layout again, the paths, the blind spots, the movement patterns, and she realized then that this was not about hiding in the system, it was about stepping into it in a way that disrupted what others believed it to be, and she straightened again, her gaze returning to him, sharper now, more deliberate. "Then it has to look like I belong here," she said, and for the first time, there was no pause at all, only immediate agreement in the way his head inclined slightly, the way his expression remained steady but shifted just enough to acknowledge the precision of her thought. "Exactly," he said, and the word carried a quiet finality, as if something had just aligned, something he had been waiting to confirm, and Emily felt that settle into place inside her, the realization that she was no longer just adapting to his world. She was beginning to understand how it moved, how it functioned, and more importantly, how it could be used, and she glanced once more at the screen showing the outer perimeter, the stillness that now felt less like calm and more like observation, and she spoke again, her voice quieter but more certain. "If they are watching, then they are already deciding what I am," she said, and he turned slightly toward her, his attention fully on her now. "Yes," he replied, and Emily held his gaze, her expression steady, her thoughts clear in a way they had not been before. "Then we decide first," she said, and the words did not feel like a question, they felt like a conclusion, and for the first time since the night began, there was something unmistakable in his response, not approval, not surprise, but recognition, as if she had crossed a line he had been watching for, and he stepped closer again, not imposing, but aligning himself with that decision, his voice lower now, more deliberate. "Then you will not be seen as a mistake," he said, and the words carried a different meaning now, not just about how others viewed her, but about how she would define herself within this system, and Emily felt that settle deeply, because it was the first time since everything had begun that she had a role she could choose, not one forced on her, not one she had fallen into, but one she was stepping into deliberately, and she nodded once, small but certain, because whatever came next, she understood one thing clearly now, staying here was no longer about survival alone, it was about control, and as she looked at the screens again, watching the system move, adapt, respond, she realized that the moment she chose not to hide, everything changed, not just for her, but for whoever was watching from the outside, and somewhere in that quiet, controlled room, the balance had already begun to shift. Emily felt the shift settle into the room like something invisible but undeniable, the kind of change that did not need to be announced because everyone inside the system could already feel it, and she stood there for a moment longer, her eyes on the screens, watching as subtle adjustments continued to ripple outward from the decision they had just made, angles widening, focus recalibrating, not reacting to the outside presence but redefining how it would be seen, and that was when it became clear to her that this was not just about defense, it was about narrative, about controlling what others believed long before they could act on it, and she exhaled slowly, her posture shifting almost without her noticing, shoulders straighter, gaze more direct, because she was no longer standing outside of it, she was part of it now, and she turned slightly toward him, her voice calm but purposeful. "Then they need to see it clearly," she said, and he looked at her, not questioning, not correcting, simply waiting for her to finish the thought, and she continued, her mind moving faster now, aligning pieces she had not even realized she was collecting, "Not just that I am here, but how I am here," she added, and something in his expression changed again, subtle but distinct, not surprise, but recognition, as if the clarity she had reached was exactly what he had been waiting for, and he nodded once. Slow and deliberate, "Yes," he said, and the word carried weight, approval. Without saying it directly, and Emily turned back to the screens, her attention narrowing as she studied the layout once more, the pathways, the visibility points, the places where presence would be undeniable but still controlled, and she pointed toward one of the external cameras, her voice steady as she spoke. "There," she said, indicating a section near the main entrance, visible from multiple angles but still within the structure of the system. "If they are watching, that is where they will look," and he followed her gesture without hesitation, his gaze locking onto the same point, and for a moment the room felt completely still, as if everything was aligning around that single decision. And then he moved, not quickly, not abruptly, but with the same precise certainty that defined everything he did, issuing quiet instructions that were followed instantly, the system shifting again, not dramatically, but enough to reshape the perception of that space, and Emily felt it, the way control extended outward, not just through commands but through understanding, through anticipation, and she realized then that this was what separated his world from the one she had known before. Nothing here was left to chance, everything was positioned. Everything was intentional, and she turned back to him, her voice quieter now but more grounded. "And when they see it," she said, "they will assume I belong to you," and the words hung in the air for a second, carrying implications she had not fully considered until now, and his gaze held hers steadily, not denying it, not softening it. "That is the point," he replied, and Emily felt something tighten in her chest at that. Not fear exactly, but awareness, because belonging in this context was not simple, it was not temporary, it was something that carried weight, consequences, perception that extended beyond this moment, and she swallowed, her eyes flicking briefly back to the screens before returning to him. "And if they believe that," she said slowly, "then they will stop seeing me as a variable," and he inclined his head slightly, confirming it without words, and Emily nodded once, small but certain, because she understood now, not just what they were doing, but why, and for a moment the room felt quieter again, not with uncertainty, but with anticipation, as if everything was waiting for the next move to unfold, and she took a slow breath, steadying herself before speaking again, her voice carrying a different kind of strength now, one that had not been there before. "Then we do it properly," she said, and he looked at her, his attention focused entirely on her now. Not on the system, not on the screens, but on the decision she was making, and for a second the world seemed to narrow down to that space between them, and then he gave a small nod, final, definitive. "We do," he said, and the simplicity of it made it more real, not less, and Emily felt that reality settle into place, not as something she feared, but as something she had chosen, and as the system around them continued to adjust, preparing for what would come next, she realized that this was no longer about surviving the night, it was about shaping what came after it, and somewhere beyond the walls, beyond the gates, whoever was watching would soon see exactly what they were meant to see, and believe exactly what they were meant to believe. Emily stood at the edge of the entrance where the cameras converged, the place she had pointed to, the place they had chosen, and for a moment everything felt unnaturally still, not quiet in the way of absence but quiet in the way of focus, like the entire system had narrowed its attention to this single point, and she could feel it even without looking at the screens, the subtle shift of awareness, the invisible line where observation turned into interpretation, and she adjusted her posture. Slightly, not dramatically, just enough to carry intention, her shoulders straight, her movements controlled, because if they were watching, then every detail mattered, every second would be read, analyzed, turned into meaning, and she refused to let that meaning be decided for her, and she heard his footsteps behind her, steady, unhurried, and she did not turn immediately, she did not break the frame they had created, because this was not about reacting, it was about presenting, and when he stepped into position beside her, not too close, not distant, exactly where he needed to be, the image completed itself without a single word being spoken, and Emily felt it, the shift in perception that would follow, the assumption that would form from this single moment, and she let her gaze move forward, not searching, not uncertain, just present, as if this place was not new, not temporary, but hers to stand in. And beside her, his presence did not dominate, it defined, quiet but absolute. The kind of control that did not need to announce itself. To be understood, and for a brief second, she allowed herself to breathe, slow and steady, grounding in the choice she had made, because this was no longer about being brought here, it was about standing here, and the difference mattered, and somewhere beyond the gates, beyond the reach of the cameras, she knew they were watching, measuring, adjusting their understanding in real time, and she imagined what they would see. Not a frightened woman pulled into something she did not understand, but a presence, aligned, composed, part of a structure they could not easily read, and that was the point, that was what would change the outcome, not hiding, not running, but rewriting the narrative before it could be used against her, and she felt something settle inside her, not certainty, not completely, but something close to it, something steady enough to hold on to, and after a moment that stretched just long enough to be intentional, he spoke, his voice low, measured, carrying just enough to reach her without breaking the stillness. "They see you now," he said, and Emily did not look at him, did not shift, her gaze remaining forward as she answered, her voice just as controlled, just as deliberate. "Then let them decide," and the words felt different as they left her, not uncertain, not reactive, but chosen, and for a second the air between them held that meaning, that alignment, and then he spoke again, quieter this time, but with a weight that settled deeper than anything else he had said. "They already have," he replied, and Emily felt that in a way she could not fully explain, because it meant the moment had passed, the decision had been made somewhere beyond her reach, beyond her control, and yet not entirely, because she had shaped what they saw, she had stepped into it willingly, and that changed what came next, and slowly, finally, she turned her head just enough to meet his gaze, not questioning, not uncertain, but aware, and there was something different in his expression now, not calculation, not distance, but recognition, clear and undeniable, as if the line between them had shifted without either of them naming it, and for a brief second, the world narrowed again, not to danger, not to strategy, but to that shared understanding, and then the moment passed, the system continuing to move, the world outside continuing to watch, and Emily turned her gaze forward once more, her posture steady, her presence defined, because whatever came next, whatever decision had been made beyond those gates, she was no longer just part of the situation, she had become part of the equation, and as the silence settled again, she realized something she had not expected when the night began, that stepping into his world had not erased her, it had forced her to redefine herself within it, and somewhere in that realization, something quiet and powerful took root, because she understood now that control was not always about power, sometimes it was about perception, and tonight, she had changed both.